Back in 1996, the PlayStation was only a year and a half old. Most of the big games people talked about were racing games, platformers, or fighting games. Capcom was one of the biggest names at the time, but their identity was tied to arcades. Street Fighter II had exploded earlier that decade, Final Fight was still remembered, and Mega Man had become a staple. Capcom wasn't the company you'd expect to release a slow, tense horror game, but that's what happened, and it changed everything. Capcom's history goes back to the late 70s. They started as a small Osaka company making arcade machines. The early years were shaky, but by the mid 80s they'd broken through Ghost and Goblins, 1942, and then Street Fighter. By the early 90s, Street Fighter II was practically printing money. That success shaped their image, flashy, colorful, fast action. So when Resident Evil came along, it was different in every possible way. The idea of Resident Evil started years earlier with a game called Sweet Home. It came out in 1989 on the Famicom based on a Japanese horror movie. It was about 5 people trapped in a haunted mansion, juggling limited supplies, exploring rooms, and solving puzzles. It's an important point because Sweet Home set the blueprint. The director of Sweet Home was Tokuro Fujiwara. He later became a producer at Capcom. When he saw the PlayStation hardware, he thought, this is the time to revisit that idea, and he handed the project to a younger designer called Shinji Mikami. Mikami wasn't the obvious choice. He had worked on licensed Disney games like Goof Troop, and he wasn't into horror movies. He actually admitted he avoided them because they scared him too much. But Fujiwara trusted him. Mikami took the job and started building the project in 1993. At first it was meant for the Super Nintendo, but they quickly saw it wasn't possible. The PlayStation gave them the CD storage and the 3D processing they needed. The first prototypes looked nothing like the final game. One version was in first person, almost like Doom, but it didn't feel tense, it felt too much like a shooter. Another early draft had supernatural enemies instead of zombies. They even tried multiplayer, but it didn't fit the hardware or the pacing. Slowly the design moved closer to what we know. Pre-rendered backgrounds, 3D characters laid on top, fixed camera angles, and slow pacing. The PlayStation couldn't render full 3D environments with the details Capcom wanted, so the team made static backgrounds, painted images, and placed 3D models on them. That limitation gave the game its distinct look. It also created the fixed camera system. The team realized those angles could be used for dramatic effect. A camera could hide something until the last second, or make a hallway feel uneasy just by what it didn't show. The controls were another result of hardware. Tank controls, forward to move, left and right to rotate, weren't anyone's first choice, but with shifting cameras it was the only consistent method. Mikami himself said he'd never loved it, but it worked, and over time that stiffness became part of the tension. The Spencer Mansion became the centerpiece. The entire game was built around its design. It wasn't a straight line, but instead it was a puzzle. You would explore, hit locked doors, find crests or keys, then double back to earlier rooms. Over time you memorized the space, and it gave players a sense of learning and ownership. But the mansion never stayed safe. Dogs crashed through windows in hallways you thought you knew. Zombies repopulated areas you'd cleared. It was always shifting. That's why the mansion is remembered as much as the enemies. It wasn't just a backdrop, but it was the game's engine. The real gameplay of Resident Evil was resource management. Jill had 8 item slots, and Chris had 6. Weapons, ammo, healing herbs, and puzzle objects all had to fit in there. You constantly had to decide what to carry. If you took too many weapons, you couldn't carry the puzzle item you needed. If you left without healing, one mistake could kill you. Safe rooms were the only relief. They gave you storage boxes and typewriters, but even saving wasn't free, because you needed increments and those were limited too. That system created constant tension, and every save was a question, and every trip through the mansion felt risky. The game introduced enemies carefully. First there were the zombies, slow, heavy, and dangerous in closed spaces. Then they came the Cerberus dogs, fast and unpredictable. Later, hunters appeared. They could leap across the screen, slash quickly, and even decapitate you instantly. Bosses weren't a flashy set of pieces, but instead they were tests. The giant snake Yon, the plant monster, the tyrant, they pushed your resources to the limit, and if you hadn't managed well, you would hit a wall. The plot was simple. A police unit investigates bizarre murders outside of Raccoon City. They are trapped in a mansion, and the mansion is a front for Umbrella's experiment. The live-action intro was shot in Japan on a very tight budget with local actors. It looked cheap then, and now it looks kinda nostalgic. The voice acting was recorded quickly with non-professional actors, and that's how we got the lines like "you were almost a Jill sandwich." The performances were wooden, but in a strange way they added to the atmosphere. What worked the best was the environmental storytelling. Scattered notes, memos, and diaries explained the outbreak. Some were clinical and other personal. One famous entry is just a researcher's final thoughts as he turned into a zombie. That style became a staple of the series and survival horror in general. Resident Evil in Japan was called Biohazard, and in the US Capcom couldn't trademark it. There was already a band and a software company using the name. So they held a contest inside the office, and the winner was obviously Resident Evil. Some thought it sounded cheesy, but it stuck, and it became one of the most recognizable names in gaming. When the game came out in March of 1996, expectations were modest. Producer Tokuro Fujiwara guessed maybe 200,000 sales, but instead it sold millions. By the end, over 4 million copies were sold only on the PlayStation. Critics praised the tension, atmosphere, and the way it felt different, but they criticized the controls and the voice acting. Nonetheless, the impact was undeniable. Capcom marketed it with a new phrase, survival horror, and that became a genre. A few things stand out when you look back at development. The Japanese intro was gorier. It had extra shots of blood and dismemberment that were cut from the US release, but later versions restored them. There was a cancelled graveyard area, and there was supposed to be a co-op, but it was scrapped because of memory limits. Capcom admired George Romero so much that they hired him to direct a Japanese commercial for Resident Evil 2. It never aired outside of Japan, but it exists, and it shows how closely the series was tied to Romero's zombie version. Resident Evil changed the company. It wasn't just another hit, but instead it gave Capcom a new identity outside of arcades. Mikami went on to oversee Resident Evil 2 and 3 Nemesis, and later directed Resident Evil 4, which reinvented the formula. The franchise became one of Capcom's 3 core series, along Street Fighter and Mega Man. It also inspired spin-offs, comics, novels, and eventually a movie series. Nearly 30 years later, the first Resident Evil still has power. The polygon models look primitive, the voice acting is awkward, and the controls are hard to get used to. But the mansion design and the scarcity of resources, the use of fixed cameras are still very effective. The game forces caution, it makes you think before you act, and it keeps you uneasy even in silence. That's the true essence of survival horror. In 1996, Capcom took a chance. They put a young director who didn't even like horrors in charge of a very risky project. They built a game around limitations instead of spectacle. And that gamble worked. Resident Evil became a massive hit, defined survival horror, and gave Capcom a franchise that is still alive today. People usually laugh at the cheesy acting and tank controls, but under all that is design, it's tight, it's smart, and it's deliberate. The Spencer Mansion may be just polygons and painted backdrops, but it still remains one of the most important locations in gaming history.